Remember back in the day when every game was on a cartridge and every movie was on a disc? Well, I got a hankering to bring something like that back. Now, of course, we have modern formats like micro SD cards, and those are very practical, but they're not as fun. I want something that has that same, usefulness. You can put a movie or a game on it, but I want it to have a more nostalgic feel. In this video, we're going to build exactly that. We're going to talk about building cartridges, building a drive to read those cartridges. On paper, it seemed simple to do this, but in practice, it was a whole endeavor. So settle in and let's get into it. This all started with this regular floppy drive, and regular is a strong word because it's really the cutest floppy drive I've ever seen. I wish I could tell you what make or model it was, but I have no idea. It had no markings on it. All it said was that it was from Australia. I bought this with the intention of replacing the internals with some sort of single board computer, and that's exactly what I did. If we look around back, you can see that it's got an HDMI port and power, things floppy drives don't normally come with. Inside, this thing is a freaking mess. Under the wires, we can see a Latte Panda, which is like a Raspberry Pi alternative. And this was my first hardware project, first 3D printing project. It took me months to figure this thing out and get it, functional as it is. I'll put a link in the description if you want to learn more about this specific device, but I really want to focus on the cartridges for this video. So I figured it's a floppy drive. We should have floppy looking cartridges that can plug in. So our first version of a cartridge for this was designed by my brother, and it looks a heck of a lot like a floppy, but really it's just a big SD card kind of adapter. An SD card goes in this little slot, and then it breaks out the pins from that to the edge, and then we could create a reader on the other side that routed that back to a normal SD card reader, because it's really just still reading the normal SD card. But immediately we had an issue. Turns out, didn't know this, never ordered a PCB before, the edges are pretty sharp. And the front panel of this floppy computer is the original plastic, and I could not risk damaging that with the sharp edge of the PCB. So we had to pivot to an entirely 3D printed cartridge, which was softer and had no chance of scratching that rare front panel. These are also based around a micro SD card, but unlike the PCB version, they're just mounted in 3D printed plastic, so it'll line up when you insert it into the drive. Similar to the production of an Andes Candies, the result is something that's pretty mint. It's really nice looking, it feels pretty good. On the drive side, this USB-C connects to a very small micro SD card reader that I took the case off of and made a new 3D bracket for, so it lines up with the card mounted in the cart. So yeah, seems pretty good. Seems like there's no issues. So the first issue is that the wobbling of the micro SD card would sometimes cause it to come out of alignment and rub against the metal bracket of the SD card reader on the inside of the drive. This would cause a little bit of chipping and eventually destroy the micro SD card. The other issue is that this is a big flat piece of plastic. It was slow to print. So I printed a bunch of them, but it was just really, really tedious. And I even tried sending away to a place. I was like, maybe I could order a bunch of them, get them printed by someone, but it was really expensive. So I was like, that's just not going to happen. Sadly, we're constrained by the shape of the front of the floppy drive. So if we want to make significant changes to the cartridge, we're going to need a whole new computer to read it. And so that's exactly what I built. This is a game work, and just like my floppy computer, it's a single board computer with a custom drive put into it. But again, if you want to learn more about this, I'll put the link to the video in the description, but let's talk about the cartridges. These are a lot like the original floppy cartridge. They are just an SD card slot that connects to these pins on the edge. Now, I added a bit of 3D printed plastic here to cover the electronics, but it functionally is the same. Little did I know, introducing the 3D printed plastic introduced a whole other issue. By this point, the old carts had been sitting on my desk for a few weeks, and I started to see the labels start to peel up. You can kind of see it here in the reflection. To get around this, I moved from 3D printed plastic to laser cut acrylic, which is perfectly smooth and stickers love to stick to. However, screws would strip out the plastic so they wouldn't screw on. So I was like, what if I fill it with hot glue and hold it on that way? That was a terrible idea. So I gave up on the acrylic and went back to 3D printing, and I tried some variants where you would put a cover layer over the sticker and that would screw down separately. But it was just, they were ugly and they looked weird and they were really thin, so they were fragile. It just wasn't really working. Whatever, I could get different glue, but there was a bigger issue here. Because of the simplicity of this drive, it's just a little connector that the cart actually slides into. It's really snug. Pushing it in takes a lot of effort, and pulling it out actually takes so much force that it kind of damages the cart drive sometimes and either scratches it or hurts it right here on the edge. To fix this, I was going to need to do a lot of work. I needed to redesign the drive so that it somehow had a lighter touch or could release or something, and this led into the next issue. The first two versions of this drive I had built into bigger like single board computer projects, and the problem with that is that to do a different version of the drive, I needed like a whole new computer project to go with it. So I started working on this, which is a standalone like external drive that you might connect to a desktop. On the back, it's got a USB-C port, and it takes the same cartridges that the last revision did. I've actually shown this revision on the channel before. On the inside, we have all the same components from the last version, but we add a small microcontroller and a servo that allows the cart to be ejected. In this old footage, you can see on the inside of the drive, it's all off-the-shelf components. We have a USB hub I found on Amazon, a bunch of other little tiny bits that are just jammed in there. And this did work most of the time, but not all the time. The big difference with this version was that that big dark connector that the cartridge used to connect to, I started cutting in half, and the idea was that if I cut it in half, I could then mount it at any height I wanted and get the exact right tension that I thought was appropriate. The problem is 3D prints, especially ones with lower infill percentages, are always like more soft and more flexible than you really want, and especially if you're using bolts that don't screw into a nut or a heat set insert, they just screw into the plastic, things are just going to slowly move over time. For this project, that resulted in me having to pinch right here in order to get it to read consistently because something was shifting just enough that it was coming out of alignment or not making good contact. So I decided I was barking up the wrong tree. I needed to make a different style of read head that I designed myself specifically to read these cartridges. But in order to do that, I had to deal with... Okay, well, it's a little unfair to say he was the problem. So what was happening was up until this point, all the custom PCB work we'd done really was my brother leading, and I was kind of guiding based on what we wanted to do. And it wasn't working. It was too slow. So I needed to learn to do my own circuit board design. So I made this PCB, which goes with Mr. Dice, my dice rolling gadget, which I'll link in the description. And that was the simplest circuit board I could imagine. And I was just like, hello, Qbert. I'm going to keep practicing and iterating until I can make the ones that I need for this project, which are substantially more complex than Mr. Dice. The next PCB after that was this little USB breakout board. I just had a USB-C port that connected to these holes. It has a couple resistors, so it would ask for the right voltage, and then it broke out into this JST connector. After that, I needed a hub for this to connect to, so I made this board that has a little more complexity again. It's got this IC on it, that's a USB hub, it's got a place for a microcontroller, it's got a big capacitor so that it can power a servo, and then finally I started working on the actual read head, which again is a little IC, this one's an SD card reader, and it just connects to these little holes which can have pogo pins, which are little springy pins on them that make contact with the cartridge. I was really optimistic after doing a few iterations on these boards that I would be able to pack these into a form factor that was similar to the other version of the drive. However, realistically, that did not happen. There was a combination of factors. My circuit boards had mistakes, so I had to add extra wires around those, and there were just like a lot of moving components, a lot of wires to route, and it was just really quickly becoming very complicated. Not to mention, the read head in this version was designed to move, and that added a whole other mechanical element to this drive. So after months of additional work learning to make these circuit boards, I was kind of back where I started. I might have even been in a worse position because I'd basically spent months making what is only good as a cat toy. Around the same time, I stopped doing YouTube full time, and so I was feeling kind of like a failure in a lot of ways, honestly, and I took a break from this. I was just tired of working on it, and I was like, I don't know if I even care. They're just cartridges. What's it matter? So I took a break, but luckily, a couple months later, I had some energy and we came back to it. Upon my return to this project, I realized I really needed to make some tweaks to the cartridges. I'd been assuming for a long time that those were done, but I decided they really weren't. I wanted the labels to be bigger. I wanted them to be more like the floppy drive cartridges because I just felt like those looked cooler. To fix that, along with other issues, I did a new version of the PCB. I made the pins on the bottom quite a bit wider because, we had the extra space, but also if there was any slop in the alignment in the drive, those thin pins wouldn't make good contact, so this helped that. I also got rid of some of the extra holes we didn't need, and perhaps most interestingly, I finally made a version that doesn't require an SD card. This second variant has what's called an XTSD on it, which is a surface mount version of an SD card, so I can get these manufactured and they'll have this small amount of storage built in. We'll still want the SD card slot version for anything over a gigabyte or so, but this is still really useful. To get the labels to adhere better and solve that issue we talked about forever ago, I've been spraying these with a layer of Mod Podge hard coat. That gives it a surface that the sticker's like a bit more. The adhesion still isn't perfect, but it's a lot better than just straight on the 3D print. It also changes the surface texture of the prints quite a bit, so they feel cooler in your hand, like they feel nicer, gives it a little bit of a shine. It just kind of adds a little bit of polish to the whole thing, really. With these changes, the core dimensions of the cartridge remained the same, but with the longer plastic, they would no longer fit into any of the drives I'd been prototyping. So I decided to just use some of the parts of those that worked and move them into a new version. Specifically the SD card reader head. I just made a version of that had the correct spacing for the new pins. Instead of the complex design with the USB hub, we're just going to connect this SD card reader to one of the USB breakout boards I designed earlier. Aside from the circuit board, we're going to need the pogo pins, which are actually the springy pins that make contact with the cartridge. We'll need an LED that will flash when we're using the cartridge. We'll need another JST-SH connector. That is the one that has the pins for the LED. That connects to the other matching port right next to the USB one on our PCB. Then we'll need some 3D printed chunks to mount this all together, but we'll get to that in a second. First, let's go ahead and solder those pogo pins into our reader head. This is a pretty easy process. The pins poke through the holes so they can kind of hold themselves while we solder them in. There was also one mistake on this version of this board where one pin that needed to be connected to ground was not, so I'm just going to add an extra wire to fix that. With that all soldered up, we're looking nice and good, so I can take the first 3D printed bracket and our set of screws. Now these screws are going to go through and actually connect to a nut on the other side. That's going to hold this nice and firm, so even with repeated pressing from cartridges coming in, it's not going to shift around at all. The main drive bay is made up of two big chunks. This is the top chunk and the USB port connects to that. Then the second layer helps to hold the USB port even more because it's, quite a bit of force when we connect and disconnect the USB cable. The wires route through a hole in the plastic. The JST connects to the USB breakout. The other loose wires are going to connect to this LED that's in the front. A small piece of translucent printed plastic will help to diffuse our LED a little bit and give it a bit more of a polished look. These tall screws provide the majority of the strength. They help align the layers, but they also, hold the whole darn thing together. I put a couple of washers on each of those, 3 to be exact. The reed head can be adjusted up and down to get just the right tension, and I found 3 washers was the perfect height for, the washers I was using. I'll put some nuts on and loosely tighten them. Down by the front we have 3 more screw holes. These help with alignment, but they also help pinch the plastic right around the LED so we don't get any light bleeding through the layers and it only goes through that translucent chunk. After those are in, I'll go back up to the top, tighten those main long screws so they're nice and snug, and then we can take a look and make sure everything feels like it's, properly aligned. At this point I can go grab a cartridge, plug it in, and make sure that that tension feels right. We still have to wire up the LED, so let's do that. While Chunky nibbles on my carefully constructed project, I'll go ahead and snip off the 2 extra wires. We just need the signal and the ground to make that LED flash. Then I can route those through the plastic, cut them to size, and I crimped on a little end so that I could kind of jam them onto the metal bits of the LED. That's not really how these crimped connectors are supposed to connect to things, but I think it's just fine. Giving it a quick test, we should see a flash of the LED when the device gets power. And then if we insert a cartridge, we should also see some flashing from it reading the initial state of that cart. Fantastic. The electronics look all good. Everything is working as expected, but we're not done. We still got to make a case for this thing. So let's transition over to that. While I'm tidying up, I want to give a quick shout out to Next PCB. They're not a sponsor, but they do provide PCB fabrication services to the channel for free, so check them out. And another shout out to Bamboo Labs. They make great 3D printers, also provided some to the channel for free, and that's super important for this next bit. Anyway, let's get into making this thing really pop by getting some painted elements on here. First thing I did was print out these pieces with high quality settings on my X1 Carbon. Then I took them outside and used my new sanding sponges to get an even smoother finish. Once it was nice and smooth, I threw it right in the trash because I realized I accidentally printed an old version of the file. Luckily, the Bamboo X1 is fast as heck, so pretty soon I had a new one, and I did the same thing, sanding it again. After that, I glued an acrylic rod to it so I had a handle to spray it without getting crap on my hands. Then I sprayed it with the same hard coat I used for the cartridges, and then put it with the cat food to dry. After this, I just repeated this process, sanding it finer and finer until eventually we got to the paint phase and we ended up with this. And oh boy, I was worried it would not come out good. Do not worry, it came out real good. I think the paint went down great. The texture is fantastic. So we can take those internals we built before, and those are just gonna slide right inside of our new printed parts. Once that's in there, we can put the back cover on. That squeezes down. Then we have a couple of screws to add to hold everything in place. Now we're not quite done yet. This thing slides around, so we're gonna get some rubber feeties, and that's gonna make it solid AF. Now I'm gonna be honest, I think this thing looks absolutely freaking stunning, but you know I love my beige, so I had to make a second one. Except for the color scheme, these are exactly the same. They both are fully functional, all built up, and I can't tell you which one I like more. I love the sharpness of the red, but I also love the nostalgia of the beige. If you have a favorite, let me know. They both turned out really, really fantastic. You know, we can't end it without showing it actually working. You can see on my computer I have those two 1TB drives that I use for editing, and when I plug that cartridge in, this is one of the ones with the XTSD, so it's 256 megabytes of raw storage. And I'm going to tell you right now, it is not a copy of Snatcher. There's something much, much cooler on this disc, and that is a photo of my play button. I can't explain how crazy it is to have 100,000 people who said they liked the stuff I was making. So thank you to everyone who supported the channel over the last year and a half. Thank you to my fiance and just everyone around me who deals with me talking about these projects all the time. And most of all, thank you all for watching and sharing, and the nice comments and the nice emails. And thanks a lot, and I'll see you soon.